Hello and welcome to the Starting Necron series, the series where we go from your first purchase to your first 2000 point army list and everything in between for the Necron forces. In this video we'll be taking a look at the various heavy support choices for the Necron army, and unlike many of the armies I've covered, the Necrons have a very soft heavy support slot, and oftentimes it's a unit type that's ignored within tournament play. That's not to say there aren't any viable options within the heavy support slot for the Necrons, but rather that the Necrons generally have enough firepower overall, as well as having a lot of strength in other unit types, such as their fast attack and elite units that bring incredible power to the army, as well as troops that can be taken in mass quantities rather easily. So let's take a look at what the heavy support option offers to the Necron army. The following units are presented in most common to least common in terms of tournament play, and the first unit on the list is the Lokhust Heavy Destroyer. The Lokhust Heavy Destroyer is reasonably costed at 70 points per model with a movement speed of 8 inches, 3+ ballistic skill, and a toughness of 5, as well as having a regular 3+ save, as well as having 4 wounds on the body. This makes it somewhat resilient and fast moving, although it lacks any kind of protection beyond that in its base form. For weapons, the base loadout is a Gauss Destructor that is also the most common option within tournaments, and it packs quite a punch with a long range of 36 inches and a strength of 10, 4 armor penetration, and a damage profile of 3d3, meaning that it has a base damage of 3, an average damage of 6, and a high end of 9 damage if it wounds. The Destructor hits like a truck, and considering you can take 2 heavy destroyers for 140 points, it's rather reasonably costed, as it's about the same cost as a Dune Crawler with a neutron laser, but you're a bit more consistent when using the Lokhust Heavy Destroyer, and you have a higher top end in terms of damage, although you have a lower top end in terms of the number of shots you can get. More so, as the heavy option is so open for the Necrons, you can easily fit in multiple units of a single or multiple Lokhust Destroyers if you want, which does give them more versatility and survivability as a whole, which does actually add a lot of benefit to taking a Lokhust Destroyer, considering how little competition it has, while also being able to bring a lot of firepower to the table. The Heavy Destroyer can also take a different weapon, which is the Enmitic Exterminator, which can be reasonably good if you think about it. It has the same range as the Destructor, but only has a strength of 7 and only 1 armor penetration as well as damage. However, instead of having 1 shot, it has 3d3 shots, meaning that on average it gets 6 shots, but has a minimum of 3 shots whenever shooting. As a whole, this isn't that impressive of a weapon, but if you can give it an extra 1 or 2 armor penetration, it does become a lot scarier, as it's somewhat comparable to autocannons in other armies. Especially with things like the Death Guard becoming popular, having damage 1 instead of damage 2 isn't as big of a deal. Maybe in some kind of method army, this could be a rather fun unit to run with this kind of loadout, because they can actually gain that extra armor penetration to make the number of shots a lot more frightening than having that one big shot that does a lot of damage. Also, don't forget this is a destroyer model, so it does have hardwired for destruction, which allows it to reroll hit rolls of 1, and unlike other destroyer models, it does have another special ability called Repulsor Platform that lets it move and ignore penalties when shooting heavy weapons after moving. The Lokhust Heavy Destroyer also has a special stratagem called Extermination Protocols, which for 2 command points lets it reroll wound rolls. With a high strength of 10 on the Gauss Destructor, you usually won't be too in need of this stratagem, though sometimes on very specific targets you might want to use the stratagem just to assure that you get the damage in. Also, as this benefits the whole unit, it does give some argument to taking larger units of heavy destroyers as opposed to individual heavy destroyers to fill up the heavy support slot. Then again, this is far more niche than the benefits of spreading them across different units, so most of the time you're going to want to take them in individual units to spread them out and gain the versatility versus having this ability, because once again the strength 10 does usually mean you have a very easy time of wounding. As a whole, the Lokhust Heavy Destroyer is rather well costed and can be a serious bunker buster as well as a mid-range swarm destroyer with the Enmitic Exterminator blast weapon. That being said, there is a lot of strong shooting within the Necron forces and things like the Canoptic Race as well as Scorpic Destroyers that let the Necrons be more of a melee assault force than a gunline army. However, even with all of that in consideration, it's still a fine unit in a unit slot that's not very dense, so there's a lot of opportunity to take it and use it within an army without sacrificing much except for the points. After the Heavy Lokhust Destroyer comes the regular Lokhust Destroyer in second place for the Necron heavy support options. I think this might be a bit of a sleeper unit, as well as one that can maybe use a bit of a points decrease as well. The regular Destroyer is about the same as the Heavy Destroyer, but it only costs 55 points and only has 3 wounds, but is otherwise very comparable in terms of the stat line. So if you know the stat line of the Lokhust Heavy Destroyer, you know the stat line of the Lokhust Destroyer except for the wounds. The regular Lokhust Destroyer also only has 1 weapon option, being the Gauss Cannon, which really isn't that bad. bad, coming with 3 shots, a strength of 6, and an armor penetration of 3. On average, it will score 2 damage, but can achieve 3 damage thanks to being a D3 damage weapon profile, although sometimes it will only score 1 damage as well, so it's a bit of a trade-off, though D3 damage profile is probably a little bit better against things like the Death Guard who have that built-in damage reduction than strictly having 2 damage per shot. The reason for this being is that even though it averages out to 2 damage, because some will be 1 damage and some will be 3 damage, so instead of having -1 damage to a bunch of 2 damage shots, you'll have some that are 3 damage -1 and some that are 1 damage -0, thus averaging out to a slightly higher return against things like that. However, unlike the weapons on the Lokhust Heavy Destroyer, the range is more limited on the Gauss Cannon at only 24 inches, but even with that, I would say it's a bit better than the Mimic Exterminator due to the naturally high armor penetration and the damage potential that it brings to the table. So it's definitely a great weapon against mid-range units, and I think this unit might see more play because of that in the future due to its low points cost and being in a unit type that's not very crowded. The regular Lokhust Destroyers have all of the special abilities of the heavy Lokhust Destroyer and can even include a single heavy Lokhust Destroyer in their unit, which is an interesting option which lets you get the best of both worlds, although the weapon mixing can be a bit odd due to the different types of ranges on the units. However, it's interesting that they allow you to do this, and I'd like to see more of this in the future because it's a fun way of having different types of units within the same squad while the units are still comparable in a lot of ways. I will say this, these guys are the best option if you want a good low-cost unit to fill a unit type, and would probably be much more common if we saw more brigades within the Necron forces, though I doubt we'd see that with Necrons as they don't really need to go with a brigade, which is a benefit to the Necrons because it allows them to stick with a battalion or other types of detachments while still having an incredibly powerful army thanks to the ability to take large units of Necron warriors, while many other armies might have to take a brigade and fill unit slots that they don't necessarily want to fill. Though at the end of the day, considering how much I like these guys, I do think they need a bit of a points cut because if they happen to go down by 10 points so that you can take a unit of 3 of them for 135 points, they'll probably be very viable and you'll probably see them show up a lot more, thus giving the heavy support unit type a lot more presence within the Necron armies. Even then, they'd still not be broken, which says something about them and the heavy support option for the Necrons as a whole. Coming in at third place for the Necron heavy support option is the Annihilation Barge. To start off with, this unit builds from the same kit as the Catacomb Command Barge, and it's very easy to magnetize so that you can swap between the two different options. As such, you can buy it for the Command Barge and then run it as an Annihilation Barge when you want to play around with different HQ choices or just want to try out the Annihilation Barge. So what does this barge bring to the table for 125 points? Well, it comes with a 12-inch movement speed, which isn't bad, a toughness of 6, 8 wounds, and a base save of 3+. It also has the quantum shielding ability that gives it resistance against unmodified wound rolls of 1 through 3 and a 5+ invulnerable save that can be brought up to a 4+ invulnerable save for a very short time using the quantum deflection stratagem for 1 command point. So that gives it a bit of survivability that a lot of units don't have, although I'd rather see it have a higher toughness and a 4+ invulnerable save instead of the quantum shielding. Then again, the quantum shielding is very good as well, so I can't really argue against it anyway. For weapons, it comes with a Gauss Cannon, which the regular Lokhust Heavy Destroyers carry, and a twin Tesla Destructor that has 10 shots at a strength 7, but no armor penetration and only 1 damage. Although the twin Tesla Destructor does have a 36-inch range and scores 2 extra hits on an unmodified roll of 6 to hit, so you'll be scoring a couple of extra shots every time you fire with the Tesla Destructors. There is a bit of a mismatch in range between the twin Tesla Destructor and the Gauss Cannon, so you can swap out the Gauss Cannon for a Tesla Cannon that reduces the cost of this model by 5 points and brings the range of the two different weapons more in line, though it is far weaker than the Gauss Cannon, so I wouldn't really advise replacing the Gauss Cannon as the Tesla weapons are generally a bit weak in the meta because they don't have any armor penetration, so they're only really good at shooting at units with bad armor saves already, and maybe they'll see some love if something like swarm units of orcs become incredibly popular, which they do show up time to time, so maybe in the future we'll see Tesla weapons seeing some more play. Outside of all those factors, the Annihilation Barge is a vehicle, so it does benefit from the different vehicle abilities and stratagems that all Necron vehicles benefit from, although it doesn't have any melee outside of the 3 basic attack at strength 5, so it's definitely far weaker than the Command Barge in that sense. That being said, it's not terrible, it's just not as interesting as other options, so it's a rather fringe option that mostly functions as a resilient unit that isn't too hard on the points either, so that gives you the ability to take one of these and kind of just use it to sit in on an objective or block the path of an enemy unit while getting some firepower out of it thanks to the low cost and resilience that it does have. Give it a shot, but be ready to switch it back to the Command Barge, which is an awesome option to have as it lets you experiment with fringe units like this while also being able to turn them into power units when you feel like it. Coming in at 4th place is the Canoptic Doomsday Stalker. This is definitely a popular unit and may have some merit, but hasn't really shown up in top end lists of tournament play as of yet. I definitely like it in terms of style, and I think think it can be a decent unit, though it's not as obviously strong as some of the other choices within the faction as a whole. The biggest issue is that the Doomstalker costs a total of 140 points, making it a rather heavy investment in comparison to 2 Lokhust heavy destroyers, which bring comparable, if not more, firepower to the table. Despite its points cost, it does have some benefits that make it stand out, such as a 10-inch movement speed, a toughness of 6, 12 wounds, and a 3+ base save, as well as a 4+ invulnerable save, which makes it rather resilient, and that is very important as this is a tall unit that is very easy to target and will be the target due to the massive cannon on its back. As a whole, due to the low toughness, I do kind of wish it had quantum shielding in this case, but I'll take the 4+ invulnerable save and the 12 wounds for the points cost that it does have. For weapons, it does come with a twin Gauss Flare, which is simply 2 Gauss Flares, and I think this pattern of Gauss Flares being on random units contributes to the Gauss Reaper being as popular as it is, because not only is it a bit more powerful than the Gauss Flare as it is already, but you already have so much residual Gauss Flare firepower in your army that taking additional Gauss Flares feels a bit awkward when you can take the Gauss Reaper and fill a specific role within your army that you might otherwise not be able to fill as easily as you can fill the Gauss Flare openings. In addition to the twin Gauss Flare, the Doomstalker comes with a Doomsday Blaster, which has 2 modes, being a low power mode that has a shorter range of 24 inches, a strength of 8, 2 armor penetration, and a damage profile of D3. And the Doomsday Blaster being a blast weapon, it has a profile of D6 shots, while making it a bit more awkward as this is a monstrous creature. Inversely, if you don't want to use the low power mode, you can choose the high power mode, which can only be used if the unit remained stationary in the previous movement phase, and this doubles the firing range to 48 inches while adding 2 strength and 3 armor penetration to the shooting profile of the weapon, as well as increasing the damage to D6 as opposed to D3. This is definitely a powerful profile, though it can be rather hard to set up if you're playing with a good amount of terrain, as it requires you to be stationary and have a target that you can shoot at, though you can potentially use that profile to deter enemies from being on a specific objective that is in line of sight of the Doomsday Blaster. Something interesting and unique about the Doomstalker is that it's not only a heavy weapons platform, but it's also a defender in a sense, as it not only has a Canoptic keyword, allowing it to perform heroic interventions using the Canoptic stratagem we've discussed in the past, it also has the Sentinel Construct ability that lets it declare Overwatch against units charging friendly dynasty or dynastic agents within 6 inches of the Doomstalker, and if it chooses to use this ability, it fires Overwatch in the high power profile for the Doomsday Blaster. While interesting, it's a very swingy ability as Overwatch isn't a very reliable way to hit, and with a total of D6 shots on the Doomsday Blaster, you're only very slightly favored to hit while shooting it in the Overwatch profile, meaning that in most cases you're just as likely to miss as you are to hit with one of the shots. However, the Sentinel Construct ability isn't all it brings to the table in the Protector sense, as it also has a unique stratagem known as Revenge of the Doomstalker, which lets you spend 2 command points after a friendly dynasty character is destroyed by an enemy, and when you do use the stratagem, the Doomstalker can fire at the end of the phase as if it was your shooting phase at the enemy that destroyed that character, as long as the Doomstalker can target that enemy. This stratagem also adds 1 to the hit roll when doing so. Not a bad ability, but it does mean you're losing a rather expensive character and you're spending a lot of command points to get an extra round of shooting with a single Doomstalker. So once again, it's an underwhelming ability, but one that can do some work once in a while, and you should be aware that it exists because as far as situational abilities go, this one is rather good when it does happen to go off, which won't be that often, but there will be situations where you can definitely use this to your advantage. Once again, the Doomstalker isn't a unit that's bad in theory, but a lot of its special abilities are rather underwhelming, and it requires a lot of setup while being a bit expensive in terms of points. I'd really like to see this unit see a cut in points so that it can see play, as it is a rather skill testing unit thanks to the Doomsday Blaster that it carries, as well as being a rather cool looking model that I'd like to see more of on the tabletop. Continuing the theme of Doomsday weapons, we come to the Doomsday Ark in 5th place, which has the same issue many large Necron vehicles have, which is that they cost 190 points, and that's a bit too expensive for what they usually do. For stats, the Doomsday Ark has a rather standard stat line with a 12-inch movement speed, 14 wounds, a 3+ armor save, and a 5+ invulnerable save from the quantum shielding ability, and also ignores unmodified rune rolls of 1 through 3. It also only has a ballistic skill of 3 on the top bracket, and it sports a rather low toughness of 6, which is somewhat made up for by the quantum shielding special ability, though I'd still like to see a higher toughness overall on a model like this. For shooting weapons, it comes with 2 Gauss Flare arrays that gives it the shooting capabilities of 10 Necron warriors armed with Gauss Flares, which isn't terrible as it does offer it some mid-range firepower, but what you're really getting is the Doomsday Cannon that it carries. Like the Doomstalker's Doomsday Blaster, the Doomsday Cannon has 2 modes. The low power mode has a rather good range of 36 inches, a strength profile of 8 with 2 armor penetration, and D3 damage, while the high power mode doubles the range to 72 inches gives it an additional 2 extra strength and 5 armor penetration total, as well as giving it a damage profile of D6 instead of D3. Though once again, just like the Doomstalker, the Doomsday Ark has to be stationary in the previous movement phase in order to use the high power profile. Both these profiles are blast weapons with a D6 number of shots, and once again, the blast profile isn't always the best because this is a vehicle, and most of the time when you're shooting this weapon, you're not shooting it at a swarm of units, so more often than not, the blast profile is going to be a detriment and not a benefit to this type of weapon. Outside of that, Doomsday Ark only has the generic vehicle stratagems, as well as Necron abilities such as the Dynasty benefits, Living Metal, and Command protocols, as well as the Quantum Shielding stratagem. As such, I would say the Doomstalker is preferable, as the Doomsday weapon on both is the same outside of the extended range on the Doomsday Ark, and the Doomstalker is only 140 points, with extra abilities that the Doomsday Ark does not have. On the other hand, gaining an extra 8 Gauss Flare shots for 50 points isn't exactly bad either, but in all reality, both are probably a bit too expensive in points, which hurts the more expensive option in the long run despite having more overall firepower. So once again, I would definitely take the Doomstalker before I took the Doomsday Ark, just because of how many points it costs and the fact that the Gauss Flare is a little bit underwhelming on a vehicle such as this. To wrap up the heavy support type, we come to the final choice and the only Forge World option for the Necrons in this unit type, which is the Tesseract Ark, coming in at 6th place. The Tesseract Ark is a bit of an odd looking model, but it does have its charms, though once again it comes in a rather steep price, having a points range of 170 to 200 points depending on which secondary weapons you choose for it. In terms of a stat line, it has a bit of an odd mix when compared to other vehicles in some cases. It has a standard 12-inch movement speed, 3+ ballistic skill, and a 3+ normal save, but only has 10 wounds. In addition to that, it has 7 toughness, which is nice, although it carries the quantum shielding in addition to the containment field, meaning it has a 4+ invulnerable save while ignoring unmodified wound rolls of 1 through 3, in addition to that higher than normal toughness. All of that is a bit of a strange mix, though I can't complain as it does make the model more resilient while keeping it at a normal points cost when compared to other vehicles. For the previously mentioned secondary weapons, it has 3 choices, being 2 particle beamers, which are the least expensive and give you a total of 12 assault shots with a range of 18 inches and a strength of 5, but only 1 damage and no armor penetration. So while that reduces the points cost of the Tesseract Ark to 170, it does give it a very weak secondary weapon. On the other hand, you can take 2 Tesla cannons instead, and that brings up the cost of the Tesseract Ark to 190 points, giving it 6 30-inch range shots that have a strength 6 and score 2 additional hits on an unmodified hit roll of 6, meaning that you'll on average score 2 additional hits while firing. Though like all Tesla weapons, it has a damage profile of 1 and no armor penetration, which does make it a rather underwhelming choice, and I'd rather take the particle beamer or the third choice instead. And finally, you can take the third option, which is 2 Gauss cannons that give you 6 shots at 24 inches and a strength of 6, but unlike the other 2 options, this weapon actually has an armor penetration of 3 and a damage profile of D3. This will drive up the points cost of the Tesseract Ark to 200, but if you can spare the points, the Gauss cannon is by far the strongest option, as they can actually do a good amount of damage against a wider array of targets. If on the other hand you're looking to reduce the points cost, the previous 2 options can be taken, although they'll be rather negligible in comparison to what the Gauss cannon can do. For the main weapon, the Tesseract Ark carries a Tesseract Singularity Chamber that has a total of 3 different profiles, each of which having a different range profile, and you can choose any mode when you go to fire this weapon. The first mode is called the Particle Hurricane, a short range option at 12 inches, having assault D6 shots, and a rather underwhelming strength of 4 with only 3 armor penetration and 1 damage per wound. Although this weapon does have the special ability that it always hits the target, and it will always wound the target on a 2+, unless you're targeting a vehicle, in which case it will wound on a 6. This makes the choice a decent anti-infantry weapon when targeting models with a good normal save and a high toughness profile. The second choice is the Seismic Lash, which doubles the range to 24 inches, has the same assault D6 shooting, but gains 1 strength and 2 extra damage in comparison to the Particle Hurricane. But it does lose that special ability for auto-hitting and wounding very easily. I would generally not select this mode over the first or third, unless you're planning to advance and shoot while being further than 12 inches away from the target that you're shooting at, or the target happens to be a vehicle and you still want to advance and shoot at it. The third mode is called the Solar Fire, which has the longest range at 36 inches, a shooting profile of heavy D6 shots, and a rather high strength of 8 with 3 armor penetration and a damage profile of D6. The oddest thing about this mode is that it has a D6 number of shots but isn't a blast weapon like most other weapons with that kind of shooting profile. And as a whole, I would say the third and first mode are probably the strongest, with the middle one being kind of an awkward fill-in, though in any case this weapon isn't something that's incredibly impressive compared to a lot of the other options you have within the army. For other special abilities, the Tesseract Ark doesn't have any beyond on things like living metal, command protocols, dynasty benefits, and vehicle stratagems that all other Necron vehicles have. I don't think this is a particularly great model, as on average you'll only have 3 to 4 shots with that special weapon that it carries, in addition to the secondary weapon that you choose. So you'll have to ask yourself, is a shooting profile of 3.5 average shots at a strength of 8 and an average damage profile of 3.5 and an armor penetration of 3 worth it at 170 points? I'd say probably not, as the Doomsday Stalker is generally going to be a bit better for less points, while the Lokhust heavy destroyer type units offer more flexibility as a whole. And if you take the Gauss cans on the Tesseract Ark, you can almost include 3 Lokhust heavy destroyers for the cost of 1 Tesseract Ark. So I'd say it's definitely more likely that I'd include 3 Lokhust heavy destroyers than I would include 1 Tesseract Ark within my army. I'd say that's really the issue with the heavy support choice of Necrons. Nothing is particularly that exciting in comparison to what they can already bring, and other unit types and most things are a bit too expensive in terms of points. Although if we do see a cut in points on many of these units, we definitely see them show up in more tournament play, as already the Lokhust heavy destroyers are doing alright but aren't very common, and something like the Doomsday Stalker could be a very good unit if it was less points intensive. Anyway, if you like the content, please like, subscribe, and share, as it does help the channel out, and it does help others out by helping them discover the channel so that they can better improve how they build and purchase their army. And as always, I'd like to thank my patrons. They're awesome people, and regardless if you're a patron or not, have a great day. Thank you for watching. Bye.